one more video on mind stuff. I hope I'm not boring you. It's just where I'm at these days. I have to confess that in my early efforts to declutter, I wasn't terribly receptive to recommendations to think more positively. When people suggested I be more optimistic and use more positive words, I felt like that's too simplistic. You don't understand the extent and complexity of my issues. Happy words aren't going to get me out of this mess. Positive thoughts and words alone won't get me out of this mess, but what's really been registering with me lately is how many pieces there are to this puzzle called hoarding disorder and how they work collectively. I said in a previous video how 15 minutes a day of no matter what time alone won't get me out of my predicament. But 15 minutes a day is a piece of the puzzle that helps me learn how to deal with my possessions on a regular basis instead of avoiding them to the point where it becomes an overwhelming mountain-sized task. Happy words alone won't get me out of this, but they will help me shift my mindset to better deal with my situation and to be more motivated to make changes. Because recovering from hoarding issues involves numerous facets, it feels like I'm trying to tame a beast with 9 whipping tails, or like I'm playing a game of whack-a-mole. These various aspects are all part of the phenomenon: mental outlook, physical clearing, forming new habits, building consistency, shifting perspective, self-care, gratitude. And often when I'm focused on one element, I'll neglect or forget about others. So I'm doing my 15 minutes of no matter what time, but I've slipped on actively changing my thoughts and I'm going back to negative self-talk. Or I'm focusing on what I don't have instead of what I do. Or I'm so honed in on doing what's good for the environment that I neglect to make sure I'm also doing what's good for me. It can be a lot to keep in balance, especially when you can't put your day-to-day life on pause in order to focus only on decluttering. Life continues on and throws its own curveballs to boot. So if what I'm sharing with you about how words have power sounds like hippy-dippy mumbo-jumbo to you, I get it. I'm only recently receptive to these types of concepts. It's taken a lot of reading, trying hypnotherapy, practicing meditation, listening to podcasts, but it's definitely starting to sink in for me, and I hope it will for you too. If not now, then later down the line. Anyway, that was a long preamble to what I'd like to share today. Dr. Puff's recent podcast on what he calls the happiness list. He explains how we become what we contemplate. Most people have a tendency to think the external world is what matters. How is our life going right now? But he makes a point of how two people can experience the same event, yet come out of it completely differently. I had an incident over the weekend where this clicked with me. I was taking old paint to a hazardous waste facility on my way to the farmer's market. I've only been to this hazardous waste facility once before, and I thought I knew how to get to the freeway afterwards, but I must have missed a turn because I clearly passed the freeway. I dislike driving around randomly looking for places. I like to look it up on a map and have a sense of my geographic orientation. I prefer not to rely on a computerized voice telling me where to turn, so GPS isn't my go-to. That's probably a control issue. But once I realized I was pretty much lost, I switched on GPS to tell me where to go, and it basically took me around the block. Normally, I would be upset with myself for missing the turn and having to go around the block. I'm hard on myself that way. But I immediately thought about times I've been with my brother when he hasn't been able to find some place we were going. He thought he knew where it was, but it took a bit of circling around till we found it, and it was no big deal to him. My mom? Oh my gosh, she'll start driving to a destination that she's not completely sure how to get to, as long as she has a general idea of its vicinity. She doesn't look at a map. She doesn't have GPS. She's okay with heading out to that part of town and figuring it out once she gets there. And when she reaches her destination, she is proud. She tells me, "See, I found it." So I thought about these 3 different ways of thinking about the same situation of not being able to find a destination. Excuse me. I felt much less stress by shifting my thought from I should always be able to find where I'm going without getting lost, to sometimes you get lost, but you eventually find your way. Sorry, you think I'd know how to swallow my own spit by this age. Dr. Puff points out that if we leave our mind to its own devices, whatever habits we have in place up to this point in our life, our mind will most likely go back to those habits. So if we tend to be negative, critical, depressed, we may hear one of these podcasts and be really inspired, but unless we proactively do something, we're going to go back to our habits because our minds are creatures of habit. Of course, it takes work to change old habits into healthier, more positive ones. He talks about creating what he calls the happiness list, a list of phrases, ideas, concepts that help us reshape our minds into the lives that we truly want to live. And it's important to look at the list on a regular basis because otherwise, whatever was in place will just come back. Okay, I've rambled on plenty already, so I'll let his podcast explain the details. The link is posted below. You can also subscribe to his podcast on iTunes. If you're not ready for this stuff yet, no worries. It definitely took me a while to warm up to it, and I'm still experiencing growing pains. But I hope some of you find it helpful.